The Erasure. A billionaire stands on a hospice roof in a storm, pointing a gun at his own son. Behind him, the city glows indifferent. But the real crime wasn't committed tonight. It was written into trust fund documents, whispered in therapy sessions, and hidden in Polaroid photographs for 23 years. 13 hours earlier, Elias Thorne found a folder in his father's hallway that would shatter everything he believed about abandonment, love, and the price of family silence. The rain drummed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Arthur Thorne's penthouse with an insistent rhythm that no one else seemed to notice. Elias stood by the glass coffee table, holding the small wooden box in both hands. The cedar was smooth, worn from years of being turned over in small, careful fingers. Inside were the pieces of a boat, a sailboat he and his mother had built together on a Sunday afternoon before everything ended. His father sat in the leather armchair, his posture rigid as steel, the Wall Street Journal held up like a wall between them. The only sound was the rain and the occasional rustle of expensive paper. Arthur Thorne didn't look at his son. He hadn't looked at him, really looked at him, in over a decade. Elias's damp hair clung to his forehead. He had taken the train from the city's edge where he lived, in a cramped studio above a Vietnamese restaurant. The letter had come 3 days ago, written in his father's precise hand on cream-colored stationery. Dinner, 7 o'clock, Friday. 3 words, no signature. But Elias had come anyway, because even the smallest gesture from Arthur Thorne was a gesture he couldn't refuse. "I found this in the attic, Dad." His voice was soft, hesitant. "It's the boat we built before Mom left." Arthur lowered the newspaper with calculated slowness. He didn't look at the box. Instead, his gaze drifted to his silver Patek Philippe watch, and he exhaled a plume of gray smoke from the thin cigar he'd been smoking all evening. The smoke curled through the air like something alive, something that would eventually dissipate and leave no trace it had ever existed. "Old wood attracts termites," Arthur said, his voice flat and dismissive as a court verdict. "Put it back or burn it. I have a conference call in 5 minutes." He turned back to his paper, and that was the end of the conversation. That was the end of everything, though Elias didn't know it yet. Elias walked to the hallway desk, his footsteps scuffing quietly on the marble floor. He could hear Arthur's fingers turning the pages of the journal, could hear the clink of his watch against the table. The hallway stretched before him like a tunnel, shadows lengthening as the city lights reflected off the rain-slicked glass. He saw it then, a blue manila folder, half hidden under a stack of mail on the brass tray. His hand moved before his mind could catch up. He slid it out quietly, carefully, the way someone might remove a card from the bottom of a house that everyone else had agreed was finished. The folder opened in his hands. The first document was titled, "Trust Fund Disbursement, Conditions of Estrangement," in bold black text. His thumb stopped on the line of red text that followed. "Payments conditional on zero contact with Elias Thorne." His heartbeat thundered in his ears. The words seemed to rearrange themselves, forming new meanings each time he read them. Payments, conditional, zero contact. He heard Arthur's heavy footsteps. His father was coming toward the hallway. Elias tucked the folder under his jacket with the deliberate slowness of someone moving through water. He turned toward the front door, pushed it open, and stepped out into the rain. Behind him, the heavy oak door clicked shut. The rain fell in sheets, soaking through his shirt, streaming down his face. But he didn't run. He walked, his pace even and measured, toward the street where the city's veins of red and white taillights pumped through the night. The alleyway behind the dive bar was narrow enough that the rain only fell on the outer edges. Elias and Miller stood in a pocket of relative dryness next to an overflowing green dumpster that smelled of stale beer and rotting fruit. Miller's hands were shaking as he held the flashlight. Miller had been his father's lawyer once, years ago, before Arthur had decided he was too soft, too principled, too interested in the ethical dimensions of his work. Now Miller lived in the spaces between things, between employment and homelessness, between knowing too much and saying nothing. He wore a tan trench coat that had seen better decades, and his eyes carried the permanent squint of someone who'd been looking for exits his whole life. The LED flashlight beam moved across the pages of the folder, illuminating passages, then moving on, then returning. Miller's jaw tightened with each line he read. "This is dangerous, kid," Miller whispered, his voice barely audible over the ambient hum of the city. Distant sirens, the buzzing neon sign of the bar's entrance 2 blocks away. Your old man didn't just ignore you. He paid a fortune to keep you isolated. Behind them, a sewer grate exhaled steam like a breath held too long. They didn't hear the footsteps until the shadows coalesced into forms. 2 men in identical black tactical jackets emerged from both ends of the alley. One cracked his knuckles. The other pulled a collapsible steel baton with a metallic clack that echoed off the brick walls like a starter's pistol. "Run," Miller said. But he didn't move. The baton swung first. Elias grabbed the wooden box, the one he'd retrieved from his father's hallway, and swung it like a club. It connected with the first agent's temple with a solid thud of wood-meeting bone. The box shattered on impact, splintering into pieces, releasing the miniature boat parts that scattered across the wet pavement like confetti at a funeral. Elias ducked the wild swing of the baton, feeling the air displacement as it passed his ear. He twisted, moving with the kind of instinctive violence that surprises you about yourself, that you don't know you contain until the moment demands it. The second agent lunged. Elias grabbed his wrist, twisting hard. There was a moment of perfect leverage, of physics and anatomy aligned. And then Elias drove his knee upward. The impact expelled all the air from the man's lungs, left him gasping on the ground like a fish in the bottom of a boat. The metal baton clattered across the wet pavement and disappeared into the shadows. Miller's hands trembled as he held out the folder. Elias took it, their fingers brushing for just a moment. That moment being long enough to feel the transmission of fear, the acknowledgement that they'd crossed some threshold from which there was no casual return. Elias ran toward the street. His feet pounded on the pavement, his lungs burning. Behind him, he heard the agents shouting, getting up, their boots echoing through the alley. He didn't look back. He only ran forward, into the city, into the night, into whatever came next. Clara's kitchen was aggressively bright. White porcelain, polished marble, stainless steel appliances that reflected the overhead lights like mirrors. Clara poured hot chamomile tea into 2 white cups, with the steady hand of someone who'd spent years perfecting the art of appearing unflappable. She wore a thick cashmere robe, the kind that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Elias sat at the island counter, shivering slightly, his wet hair dripping onto his shirt. The blue folder lay open between them like an accusation no one was willing to voice out loud. "Arthur is a monster, Elias," Clara said, her voice taking on that gentle, reassuring quality that had probably worked on countless people. Her therapist, her friends, her ex-husband during the divorce proceedings. "I had no idea about these documents. We'll fix this together." She slid a cup toward him. The chamomile steamed gently, releasing the kind of calming scent that was supposed to make everything feel manageable, contained, solvable. Elias watched his sister. He'd always known Clara was different from him in some essential way. She had his father's adaptability, his ability to move through rooms without leaving ripples. She had his mother's beauty. but without the softness, without the yielding quality that had eventually made her seem fragile to everyone around her, including herself. Clara's phone vibrated on the marble. It doesn't exist. She reached for the folder. Elias grabbed it and moved toward the door. He didn't run. He walked deliberately, the way someone might back away from a predator. Clara didn't follow him. She simply stood there at the marble counter, one hand still holding the knife, watching him go with an expression that was entirely unreadable. The elevator arrived quickly. He stepped inside and pushed the button for the ground floor. As the doors closed, he saw Clara's reflection in the polished steel, still standing at the counter, still holding the knife, still utterly composed. The parking garage was a cathedral of concrete and echoes. His silver sedan sat on the third level, and behind it, Elias could already hear the SUV making its way up the ramp, its tires screeching against the polished concrete with each turn. His hands were slippery with sweat. The car keys fought him for a moment before he managed to get them into the lock. The sedan's door opened, or he slid behind the wheel just as the black SUV appeared, accelerating down the lane with the kind of momentum that suggested its driver had no interest in conversations or warnings. Elias got the car into gear. The engine coughed to life. The SUV slammed into the back of his sedan with a sound like the world breaking. The impact threw his head forward, narrowly missing the steering wheel. He slammed his foot on the gas and felt the car lurch forward, metal shrieking against metal. In the rearview mirror, he could see the damage. His taillights shattered, fragments of red plastic spinning through the air like strange leaves. The SUV recovered quickly and accelerated again. Elias weaved between the concrete pillars that held up the roof of the garage. The pillars formed a maze, and he knew them, had parked here 100 times before he'd become the kind of person who needed to think about being followed. The SUV was heavier, less responsive. Its driver was aggressive, but not careful. As Elias swerved around another pillar, he noticed something under the dashboard. A small, blinking red light with the Thorne Logistics logo embossed on it. A GPS tracker. His father had been able to see every move he made. Maybe he always had been. Maybe, Elias thought, that was the entire point of the folder, the entire point of the chase. They wanted him to know? A henchman leaned out of the SUV's window, and the metal crowbar in his hands caught the fluorescent light. He swung it at Elias's driver's side window. The safety glass exploded into 1,000 pieces that fell across Elias's lap like ice, like frozen tears, like all the small, sharp things that accumulate when people try to destroy you. Elias jerked the steering wheel hard to the right. The sedan's bumper caught a structural pillar with a shriek of bending metal. Behind him, the SUV was forced to swerve, and its bumper clipped a row of parked bicycles. They scattered like a herd of startled animals, metal frames tangling together, wheels spinning. Elias gunned the engine down the exit ramp. He reached under the dashboard with one hand and pulled out the GPS tracker. It was warm from the electricity running through it. He threw it out the shattered window, watching in the mirror as it bounced on the concrete and disappeared into shadow. The SUV tried to follow, but was tangled in the bicycles, its driver cursing, its tires spinning uselessly. Elias didn't slow down. He took the exit ramp at a speed that made his tires scream, and then he was out, into the city, into the rain, into the night that suddenly felt very much like it belonged to him. The apartment was small and dusty, the kind of place where dust motes danced through single beams of light, like they were performing for an invisible audience. Miller's childhood friend, whose name Elias couldn't quite remember, had cleared out for the day. The moth-eaten sofa sagged in the middle like something that had absorbed too much weight, too much worry. Elias knelt on the floor and pulled up the floorboard. Miller had told him about this during their brief conversation in the alley. before the agents came, before everything became violence. Under the wood was a space, not large, just enough. And in that space were a micro-cassette recorder and a stack of black tapes labeled in careful handwriting. Therapy session. Project Erasure. Project Erasure. The name sat in Elias's mind like something toxic, something that would poison everything it touched. He inserted the first tape and pressed play. The machine made a soft mechanical sound, and then there was static, followed by a voice that he recognized immediately. It was the voice of Dr. Aris, the man his father had hired to help him after his mother disappeared. The voice that had filled his adolescence with clinical concern, with therapeutic neutrality, with the careful architecture of shame. The subject shows too much resilience, Dr. Aris said, his tone smooth and precise as a surgeon's instruments. We must emphasize the mother's abandonment as a total rejection of him, personally. Break the identity, and the inheritance is secure. The tape hissed. Elias let it run for another moment, hearing the sound of papers being shuffled, the clink of a pen against a glass, the ambient noise of a comfortable office where terrible decisions were being made. On the wall above the sofa was a framed photo. It showed his father shaking hands with Dr. Aris at some charity gala. They were both smiling. Behind them, a banner proclaimed something about mental health awareness. Elias looked back at the folder. His eyes moved across the pages, searching for something, though he didn't know exactly what. And then he saw it. A name he'd missed before, or perhaps had chosen not to see. Sarah Lynn, his mother. And next to her name was an address, a hospice address in the northern part of the city. She didn't leave. She was hidden. The folder fell from Elias's hands. It landed on the dusty floor with a soft thud that seemed to echo through the entire apartment. Outside, the rain continued to fall, and somewhere in the city, his mother was breathing, was living, was being kept away from him in the name of trust funds and inheritance, and a man's refusal to be disrupted by the claims of his own child. The hospice hallway was sterile and dim, lit by flickering fluorescent lights that hummed with a sound like insects trapped in the walls. Elias stopped in front of room 402. Clara and Dr. Aris stood blocking the door like sentries guarding a tomb. Dr. Aris held a medical tablet. His expression was perfectly composed. The expression of a man who had spent years perfecting the art of appearing concerned while doing terrible things. Clara looked almost sad, but her hand rested on her expensive handbag in a way that suggested sadness and complicity could coexist quite peacefully. Around them, the hospice hummed with its soft machines, its distant coughing, its smell of disinfectant and something else. Something organic and inexorable. "Elias," Dr. Aris said, his voice taking on that gentle, professional quality that Elias now understood was a weapon. Seeing her now will only trigger a psychotic break. Your mind isn't ready for the truth of her decline. The words hung in the air between them. Elias looked at his sister. He looked at the doctor. He looked at the door to room 402, which suddenly seemed impossibly far away. He didn't respond. He simply started walking toward them. The tall security guard stepped out from a side door. He was broad-shouldered, trained, professional. He didn't expect Elias to charge directly at him without hesitation or strategy or any of the things that usually prevent violence. But that's exactly what Elias did. He lowered his center of gravity and drove forward, using his entire body as a projectile. The guard didn't have time to brace himself. They collided with the force of genuine impact, and the guard slammed backward into a laundry cart. White sheets and towels spilled across the hallway floor like snow, like clouds. like all the soft things that get caught up in violence. The guard's flashlight swung in a wide arc. Elias blocked with his forearm, and the impact sent a shock of numbness from his wrist to his shoulder. He responded with a sharp headbutt, not elegant, not refined, just effective. The guard's vision swam, his knees buckled. Dr. Aris appeared with a pre-filled syringe. The needle caught the light as he moved, as if advertising its intent. Elias grabbed the doctor's wrist and twisted until the needle dropped, clattering on the linoleum floor. He pushed Aris against the wall, his forearm against the doctor's throat, and felt the man's airway compress under the pressure. "Who is paying you today, doctor?" Elias asked, his voice low and even and devoid of anything resembling mercy. "Because I'm paying you in bruises." He held him there for a moment, just long enough to feel the doctor's pulse fluttering against his arm like a trapped bird. And then he released him. Aris slid down the wall, gasping for breath. The hallway was a wreck of linens and violence, and the sudden absence of authority. Elias stepped over it all and kicked open the door to room 402. The room was perfectly made. The bed was white and flat and utterly empty. A monitor hummed with a flat-line tone, but it wasn't connected to anyone. Dust motes danced in the moonlight, streaming through the window. And Elias realized he was alone. Not just in this room, but in every room, in every way that mattered. He walked to the bedside table. A single envelope sat there, and his name was written on it in handwriting he recognized from 1,000 small moments. Grocery lists left on the refrigerator, notes packed in his lunchbox, letters that had come less and less frequently as the years accumulated. He tore it open. Inside was a polaroid photograph. His mother stood in front of the Eiffel Tower, smiling, her hair swept back from her face by wind. The date on the photo read, "Yesterday." She looked healthy. She looked alive. She looked like someone who had chosen something, somewhere. Someone other than him. On the back, in the same handwriting, a message. "I'm sorry, Elias. The price of your safety was my disappearance. Your father lied. I didn't choose to leave, but I can't come back." The photograph slipped from Elias's hands. A teardrop hit it, blurring the image of the Eiffel Tower, turning it into something abstract and impossible, and very much like a memory that had already begun to fade. The hospice roof was exposed to the storm. Rain fell in sheets, and lightning flickered across the sky like neurons firing in the brain of an angry god. Arthur Thorne stood on the helipad, his black overcoat billowing in the wind, and he looked absolutely victorious. Behind him stood 4 security guards. They had drawn their weapons, Glock 17 pistols that caught the occasional flash of lightning. Elias stood at the ledge of the roof, 3 stories above the pavement, with nowhere to go but down or back toward the guns. "You were always too emotional, Elias," Arthur called out, his voice cutting through the wind like something solid. "Just like her. Give me the folder and the tapes, and maybe I won't have to tell the world you finally snapped." The wind howled. Thunder cracked the sky open. Elias looked at his father. He looked at the guards. He looked at the city spread out below him, glowing in the rain, indifferent to everything that was about to happen. He didn't hand over the folder. Instead, he sprinted toward the ledge. His body became weightless for a moment that seemed to last forever. And then gravity reasserted its ancient claim. He fell toward the industrial waste bin 3 stories below, his body silhouetted against a lightning strike, tucked into a ball, moving through space the way objects move when they have nothing left to lose. The canvas cover of the bin tore as he crashed through it. He landed in a pile of soft medical trash, bags of bandages, soiled linens, the discarded refuse of the place where people went when their bodies began to refuse them. The impact echoed through his chest, drove the air from his lungs, but the garbage absorbed the worst of it, the way garbage absorbs everything. He rolled out the side of the bin, limping but alive, and looked up to see the guards on the roof looking down at him, looking confused, trying to process how someone could fall from the roof and walk away. Elias didn't give them time to think. He moved through the parking lot with the kind of desperation that looks like purpose. And by the time they figured out what had happened, he was already gone. The library was nearly empty at dawn. An old man slept in one of the study carrels. A woman with several shopping bags looked for a bathroom. Elias sat at one of the flickering computers and inserted a silver USB drive. The files were open on screen, the recordings from Dr. Aris's tapes converted to MP3. The documents from the folders scanned and converted to PDF. Years of manipulation reduced to data that could be transmitted at the speed of light. He opened his email. He had prepared a distribution list 3 hours earlier, and now he selected all of it. Every major news outlet, every journalist who had ever written about corporate fraud, every police department in the state, every agency that was supposed to exist to protect people from people like Arthur Thorne. A progress bar appeared. Upload to global press at 23%, then 47%, then 82%, then 99%. Elias leaned back in his chair and waited for the final percentage point to load. In the corner of the room, a television mounted on the wall showed the early morning news. The anchors discussed weather patterns and market fluctuations and traffic on the interstate. 99%. 100%. Elias clicked send. The message confirmation appeared instantly. Message sent. The television suddenly changed. A breaking news banner appeared at the bottom. Billionaire Arthur Thorne's private documents leaked online. The anchor's expression shifted from boredom to something that approximated concern. The camera cut to an image of his father's face, taken from a company website. Smiling in that way, people smile when they believe their power is invulnerable. Elias closed the browser window and ejected the USB drive. He stood up and walked toward the exit, moving past the old man in the study carrel, past the woman with the shopping bags, out into the morning that was just beginning to break open with sunlight. The park was quiet at sunrise. Miller sat on a bench near the pond, holding a blue passport. He looked older than he had a day ago, or perhaps he looked like himself. And yesterday, he'd just been wearing someone else's expression. Elias sat beside him. The passport was placed on the bench between them, like an offering. The name inside wasn't Elias Thorne. It was Elias Lynn. His mother's maiden name, the name of the person he came from before Arthur Thorne had attempted to erase him from existence. Elias ran his finger over the embossed gold seal. The passport felt real. He opened it to the photo page. The picture had been taken somewhere, by someone, at some point. The face in the photo looked like his face, but it was a face that hadn't been bruised by knowing the truth yet. From his backpack, Elias pulled the broken wooden boat. The pieces had been carefully preserved despite everything. Despite the violence in the alley, despite the run through the parking garage, despite the fall from the roof. The mast was cracked. The sail was damaged, but the structure remained intact. He took out a small tube of glue and carefully reassembled the boat. His hands were steady now. The work was meticulous and precise. He set the finished boat on the pond's edge and watched it float, watched it drift away from the shore, watched it become smaller and smaller until it was just a speck on the water. Birds chirped in the trees. Distant traffic hummed on the streets beyond the park. The sun continued its climb, indifferent to everything. Elias stood up and walked away from the bench. In his hand was the blue folder, the one that contained all of Arthur Thorne's secrets. He tossed it into a trash can without breaking his stride. He didn't look back. His mother stood across the pond, watching him. She was there for just a moment, nodding once in a way that seemed to acknowledge something. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, not any of the things that stories usually end with, but something simpler and more permanent. An acknowledgement that they had both survived what was meant to destroy them. Then she vanished into the crowd of joggers and morning walkers. Elias walked toward the parking lot. His footsteps echoed on the gravel path. The blue passport was in his pocket. His body ached from the impact of falling 3 stories. His mind felt like something that had been stripped down and reassembled in a different configuration. Behind him, the wooden boat continued to drift on the pond. Ahead of him, the city stretched out, with its millions of people moving through their days, each one carrying their own small destructions, their own small survivals. Elias reached the parking lot and got into a car that wasn't his. The engine started cleanly. He pulled out of the lot and drove toward the highway, heading north, toward the border, toward wherever Sarah Lynn was and whatever came next. He did not feel reborn. He did not feel enlightened. He did not feel anything that could be mistaken for peace. What he felt was motion. What he felt was distance between himself and what had tried to unmake him. What he felt was the steady pressure of his hands on the steering wheel and the sound of the engine and the miles accumulating between what he had been and whatever he would become. The highway stretched ahead of him in both directions, back toward the city and his father and all the machinery of money and power that had conspired to make him disappear, and forward toward something that hadn't yet been decided. Elias chose forward. He pressed his foot on the accelerator. The car moved faster. The city lights fell away behind him, and the darkness ahead opened up like a mouth, like an opportunity, like the only available path. He drove until dawn broke completely. He drove until the highway signs indicated he'd crossed state lines. He drove until the car's tank was nearly empty, and even that seemed symbolic. The consumption of one thing to move toward the next. The inevitable cost of motion. At a gas station in a state he'd never been to before, he stopped. He got out and stood in the cool morning air. A man pumped gas into the car beside him. A woman paid for coffee inside the station. No one looked at him. No one knew his name. No one had any claim on who he was or what he did next. For the first time since the folder, Elias thought about not running. He thought about stopping here, in this place, in this moment, and building something that belonged only to him. Something that his father's money had never touched, that his sister's calculations had never factored into, that Dr. Aris had never attempted to prescribe. He thought about his mother in France, standing in front of the Eiffel Tower, smiling at the camera without knowing that the photograph would eventually show her son the difference between being isolated and being alone. Elias filled the tank. He paid for gas with cash. He bought a coffee from the station's fluorescent-lit interior and stood outside with it. Watching the sun complete its climb into the sky, watching the world continue to turn indifferent to his existence, to his survival, to his reconstruction. Then he got back in the car and drove, not away from something anymore, but towards something, though even he couldn't have said what it was. The highway stretched ahead, and his hands were steady on the wheel, and the distance behind him grew larger with every mile. The blue passport sat on the passenger seat, and inside it was a face that was his, but not entirely his. A name that was his mother's, but also his own. A future that was neither promised nor compromised, nor subject to amendment by anyone's will, but his. He drove north, into the morning, into whatever came next.